Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 531, and today is January 22nd, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and we got a lot of news to get through on today's show. So be sure to share today's show. Video version is up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. We post the show where it's hosted at the Libertarian Institute and also on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find it anywhere you listen to audio podcasts, and follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. A lot of what goes into this show I'll tweet out throughout the week, and so that's a pretty good way to keep up with everything going on when it comes to foreign policy. All right, let's get into a couple stories today. This first one isn't necessarily a foreign policy story, but I thought it was really interesting. I didn't see it gain hardly any coverage, and I think this is something that could be kind of nefarious and problematic, although if somebody in my audience is a little bit more understanding of things like privacy rights and international law and how that works with U.S. court, I'd be interested in your take on this, and maybe we could put something together for the Institute. But the story here, Biden White House set up secretive court to oversee privacy rights. So Politico reports at an undetermined date, in an undisclosed location, the Biden administration began operating a secretive new court to protect Europeans' privacy rights under U.S. law. Officially known as the Data Protection Review Court, it was authorized in October 2022 executive order to fix collision of European and American law that had been blocking the lucrative flow of consumer data between American and European companies for 3 years. The court's 8 judges were named last November, including former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. Its existence has allowed companies to resume the lucrative transatlantic data trade with the blessing of EU officials. The court's location is secret, and the Department of Justice will not say if it has taken any cases yet or when it will. Though the court has a clear mandate ensuring Europeans of their privacy under U.S. law, its decisions will also be kept secret from both the European Union residents petitioning the court and the federal agencies tasked with following the law. Plaintiffs are not allowed to appear in person and are represented by a special advocate appointed by the U.S. Attorney General. And so, this is just, I think, concerning to me that there is any court that operates in this manner where the plaintiffs aren't represented in person, or, it's just essentially all put together by the U.S. government. And, the concern here, I think, is that they could issue rulings that nobody will know about for years and years that could, allow companies and people with special access. So, also, I assume the U.S. government to get away with a lot more. We know U.S. intelligence agencies are buying a lot of this data that companies also buy for advertising. And so what here is the U.S. government getting their hands on, and what are they doing with it are big questions too. Next up here, OpenAI cuts military and warfare ban from permissible use policy. So this is by Brett Wilkins. I believe originally published with Common Dreams and then republished at antiwar.com. And he writes, ChatGPT maker OpenAI this week quietly removed language from its usage policy that prohibited military use of its technology, a move with serious implications given the increased use of artificial intelligence on battlefields, including Gaza. ChatGPT is a free tool that lets users enter prompts to receive text or generated images by AI. The Intercept Sam Biddle reported on Friday that prior to Wednesday, OpenAI's permissible use page banned activity that has a high risk of physical harm, including specifically weapons development and military and warfare. Although the company's new policy stipulates that users should not harm human beings or develop or use weapons, experts said the removal of military and warfare language leaves open the door for lucrative contracts with U.S. and other militaries. And so this is from Sarah Myers West, managing director of AI Now Institute and former AI policy analyst at the FTC. And she told The Intercept, given the use of AI systems in the targeting civilians in Gaza, it's notable moment to make the decision to remove Ward's military warfare from OpenAI's permissible use policy. The language that is in the policy remains vague and raises questions about how OpenAI intends to approach enforcement. And when a lot of people think of AI and warfare, they, think Terminator, right? And with good reason. I'm not saying that, we shouldn't be worried about autonomous robots that, are equipped with guns that could just, kill people based on the code and the algorithm and everything put into that robot that allows it to like make its decisions to use lethal force or not. I'm not trying to downplay that concern. But I think, the more immediate concern with AI is what we're seeing in Israel, where even if it's not particularly effective or accurate, the use of AI to generate targeting information seems to have kind of a nullifying effect on a lot of people who would maybe be concerned about AI being involved in warfare or widespread targeting of an area. It's something similar to what the US was doing in Afghanistan with like kind of their link analysis stuff where they believe they know who's the Taliban based off of, we rated these 5 people that we believed were Taliban. We took their phones and then we put their phones in the computer program, and that computer program, decided that based on who these individual phones are calling, that they were able to conclude that, these other 5 people were also members of the Taliban. Now, the problem is, of course, is that once you start to get things wrong, you're only going to compound to get more and more wrong over time. And so, you end up killing a lot of people who aren't the Taliban or who aren't Hamas. And so that seems to me to be how this is, kind of playing out right now. Although, I do think there's reason to be concerned in that if there is any kind of legislation that bars, creating machinery and robots and things like that would not have to have a human, actually press the button to launch a strike would be something that we would also want to have. All right, next up, this article from Jason Ditz. He wrote it last week for antiwar.com. I just haven't had a chance to get to it. Defense Secretary, UK in pre-war phase with several nations. As top officials defend the decision to join the U.S. in attacks on Yemen, the British Defense Secretary has informed Parliament of potential wars in the years to come with several major nations, including Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The defense minister described the situation as a pre-war phase and cautioned that the wars with one or more of these nations could break out within the next 5 years. Britain would, of course, be directly involved. Russia seems potentially the most likely of the 4 as Britain continues to embroil itself in the Ukraine conflict, recently announcing an increase in the military funding to help Ukraine purchase new military drones. In response, Russia directly warned British deployment of troops into Ukraine would be tantamount to a declaration of war. In recent years, British officials have tried to spin the Russians as a direct threat to their interest. And historically, as a Britain-Russia rivalry has also led to military conflict. Throughout the 19th century, there was ongoing conflict encapsulated as the Great Game between British and Russian empires. Indeed, the colloquial term jingoism goes back to British music halls song in the 1870s that backing British intervention against Russia and Turkey. Britain has also sparred with Iran diplomatically in recent years, but has not been that close to direct conflict. Current conflicts with China or North Korea. It may simply be that the defense minister is predicting U.S. hostilities could quickly suck Britain in. The fact that Britain goes wherever the U.S. leads means that that should any of these American wars interventions occur, there would likely be some British involvement. And it does seem that, British is the most dedicated to the American empire most of the time, just going along exactly with whatever the U.S. does. All right, next up here, Ukraine Ground Forces commander says his troops are on active defense. Dave DeCamp wrote this for antiwar.com last week. The commander of Ukraine's ground forces says his troops are on active defense as Ukrainian forces are no longer attempting to gain territory after the failed counteroffensive. He told Reuters last week, our goals remain unchanged, holding our positions, exhausting the enemy by inflicting maximum losses. And as I explained, I'm trying to think, it might not have been on this show last week, but somewhere I did an interview. One of the things I discussed was that when Russia was on the defensive during the summer counteroffensive, Russia had well dug in positions that they had been preparing for 6 to 9 months. They had a numerical advantage as far as number of troops, and also an advantage on the amount of ammunition that they were able to fire. Now Ukraine doesn't find itself with any of those advantages and on the defensive. And I read just this weekend, the Institute for Study of War, which is a fairly pro-Ukraine outlet, is reporting that Ukraine is losing territory in 3 different places along the front. So it does not seem to be going well for Ukraine. And Kiev seems to be lashing out by conducting more attacks within Russia, which has caused Russia to carry out more serious attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. So this from Dave DeCamp, January 21st, antiwar.com. Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk market kills at least 27. So at least 27 people were killed in a Ukrainian attack on a market on the outskirts of the city of Donetsk in the Russian-controlled portion of the Donetsk Oblast, according to local officials. The head of the Donetsk People's Republic, which was created in 2014 in response to the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev, said, as a result of Ukraine's artillery shelling attack, 27 civilians have died. 25 more, including 2 teenagers, have received various wounds. He said Ukrainian forces used 152 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery shells in the attack on the market. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. has provided Ukraine with over 2 million 155 millimeter rounds and over 200,000 152 millimeter rounds. A spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the UN chief strongly condemns all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including today's shelling of the city of Donetsk in Ukraine. Russia's foreign minister condemned the attack and said Western weapons were used. This again confirms the West's direct involvement in the conflict and makes it complicit in the criminal acts of Zelensky's regime, which has once again displayed its inhumanity and hatred towards innocent people. And so my guess is that we will see another pretty large Russian missile barrage hit Ukrainian cities in the coming days and, inflict punishment on Ukraine as well. So absolutely horrible what is happening in Ukraine still. Now, Zelensky went to Davos, and I saw a lot of people sharing this article that, he was looking for a peace summit there, and people thought that this was suggesting that, oh, maybe the war is wrapping up here, that Zelensky is getting desperate, so he goes to Davos, and, he's talking to his allies about finding peace. Well, that's not quite the case. So this from Dave DeCamp, January 17th, antiwar.com. In a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Ukrainian President Zelensky reiterated his opposition to a ceasefire with Russia and pushed his peace formula, which involves several unrealistic demands to end the war. Zelensky's peace plan requires a full Russian withdrawal from territory it has captured since February of 2022, Russia giving up Crimea, war crimes tribunals for Russians, and Russia repaying reparations to Ukraine. Kiev has no shot at implementing any aspect of this peace formula since its counteroffensive failed, and Ukrainian forces are now on the defense and facing major manpower shortages. Despite the reality on the ground, Zelensky's peace formula has received backing from the U.S. and other Western nations. Zelensky said in Davos there was the most representative meeting of national security advisors regarding the implementation of the peace formula. More than 80 countries and international institutions were represented. The Swiss president said he offered Zelensky for Switzerland to hold a peace summit to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, but Russia will not be invited, and the summit is expected to focus on getting more countries to back Zelensky's unrealistic goals. And this has been happening for some time, where they've tried to roll the Middle East nations and other countries into this peace formula. The problem is that the Russians are never going to agree to it, and so if this is the Ukrainian starting point, the end of the war may be a very, very long way off, or at least would require Zelensky having a major change of heart, or maybe no longer being the president of Ukraine. Something like that would have to change before any kind of real peace could happen. Next up here, NATO to hold its largest military exercises since the Cold War. So NATO will launch major war games next week with about 90,000 troops to prepare for a potential conflict with Russia that will mark the alliance's largest military exercises since the end of the Cold War. NATO General Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, told reporters, Exercise Steadfast Defender 2024 will be the largest NATO exercise in decades, with participation from approximately 90,000 forces from all 31 allies and our good partner Sweden. The drills will take place across Europe and will involve reinforcements coming from North America. Cavoli said this reinforcement will occur during a simulated emerging conflict scenario against a near-peer adversary. So, he's talking about Russia. Admiral Rob Brouwer, a Dutch chairman of the NATO Military Committee, made clear the drills were about preparing for war with Russia. I'm not saying this war were wrong tomorrow, but we will have to realize I'm not saying it's going wrong tomorrow, but we're going to have to realize it's not a given that we are at peace, Brouwer said. So a little bit confusing, but he's basically saying that he doesn't think the war's going to break out soon, but we have to get ready for it. Brouwer suggested last year that NATO countries should discuss shifting their economies to a war economy, where civilian factories would start producing military goods, similar to what the United States did during World War II, and said on Thursday that European societies need to be ready for a conflict. He said it is the whole of the society that will get involved in the war, whether we like it or not. And so, these statements are certainly concerning. The large war games are certainly concerning. Hopefully, with getting sucked back into Middle East wars, the White House will have to come to the conclusion that we just can't fight a war with Russia at this time. But thinking that the White House is going to be realistic about their foreign policy goals probably isn't too likely. All right, next up here, we're talking about Israel and their various wars in the Middle East and the wars that they have gotten the U.S. involved in. So first up here, Netanyahu doubles down on opposition to Palestinian state after call with Biden. So there's a few stories where we're kind of getting into here. Netanyahu has now said twice that he will not allow the creation of a Palestinian state. And in between those two statements, he talked with Joe Biden for the first time in about a month. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reiterated his opposition to a Palestinian state after holding a phone call with President Joe Biden on Friday, the first conversation between the two leaders in nearly a month. After the phone call, Biden said the idea of a two-state solution being reached while Netanyahu was still in power was not impossible, but suggested he might go for an arrangement where the Palestinian state wouldn't have a military. But in subsequent statements, Netanyahu again made clear he was totally opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state. So he said, I will not compromise on full Israeli security control over the entire area west of Jordan. He's talking about the Jordan River, and this is contrary to a Palestinian state. Netanyahu again reiterated his opposition to a Palestinian state on Sunday. He explained, my insistence is what has prevented over the years the establishment of a Palestinian state that would have constituted an existential danger to Israel. As long as I am prime minister, I will continue to strongly insist on this. Now, that first statement, by the way, where he says the entire area west of the Jordan. Now, some people were incorrectly using quotation marks to say that Netanyahu said that, Israel will exist from the river to the sea, which from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free is a frequent chant that is used among supporters of Palestinians. It is not in any way calling for a genocide of the Israeli people. It is just a slogan that they use to express that, there are millions of Palestinians that live between the river and the sea under apartheid conditions. That's what they're talking about. And so there was, that wasn't exactly correct to say that, Netanyahu actually used the phrase from the river to the sea, but he did say security control over the entire area west of the Jordan River. And so if you look at a map, the land area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is Israel. And so, he is essentially saying from the river to the sea, there will only be Israel. Now, this is problematic because at the beginning of the war, when pro-Palestinian people went out in the street, they said from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And in order to try to hem in and constrain the protesters, the, mainstream media, along with the Israeli and U.S. governments, invented this fiction that anybody who said that isn't really calling for the Palestinians to be free. They're calling for the genocide of the Jewish people, which I know is stupid and doesn't make sense, but that is what the mainstream media established for itself as a standard. And so now you have the Israeli prime minister saying a variation of that quote. And this should be problematic for the mainstream media who try to condemn thousands of, hundreds of thousands of young Americans who are out in the street advocating for the freedom of Palestinians and trying to call them genocidal anti-Jewish maniacs, right? So because they were using that phrase, and now you have the Israeli prime minister using it, who is actively carrying out a genocide in Gaza. And, so now we have Kirby, I believe, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, was asked by reporters, well, isn't this problematic? And Kirby really tried to dip and dodge and wouldn't answer the question and wouldn't condemn Netanyahu for it. But, this is just another case where the hypocrisy not only is so clearly on display, but really the problem that this causes for the Biden administration, right? Where Netanyahu saying, there's not going to be a Palestinian state means that the American policy, what they've been saying for years is the reason that they need to support Israel is, to eventually see the establishment of a Palestinian state, isn't going to happen, according to our great allies in Israel, would seem to be a real problem for the White House. But it really hasn't been any issue at all for the White House. A part of the reason maybe is what we were talking about on the last show, where there are some members of the administration who are apparently talking about a post-Netanyahu Israel, and they, think that, well, we'll get a Palestinian state once Netanyahu is gone. I don't think they understand the politics of Israel when they make those kinds of statements. And I also think there's a little bit of a problem there when, you think about the timeline here, and it could well be that Netanyahu is in office far longer than Joe Biden. All right, so next up here, article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on January 21st, Dems call for Biden to rethink unconditional support of Israel. As Tel Aviv continues to ignore requests from Washington, a growing number of Democratic lawmakers are breaking with the White House and calling for placing conditions on aid the U.S. sends to Israel. In recent days, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has twice declared that Tel Aviv will never allow Palestinians to have an independent state. For decades, Washington has called for the Israelis and Palestinians to adopt a two-state solution. However, Israel, for years, led by Netanyahu, has worked to undermine the process for a Palestinian state. Senator Chris Van Hollen has emerged as one of the loudest critics of Biden's unequivocal support for Israel. He has previously blasted Tel Aviv for restricting aid to Gaza by using an onerous inspections protocol for trucks entering Gaza. Van Hollen has also slammed the White House for allowing Tel Aviv to ignore its request. Following Netanyahu's explanation that Israel is the only state that will exist between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, Van Hollen said, "I think people are at the end of the ropes with the Netanyahu coalition, which includes pretty right-wing extremists. It's pretty clear that Netanyahu is listening much more to the extremists in his government than the President of the United States and the Biden administration." He demanded Biden stop sending mixed signals to Netanyahu. The senator highlighted that the White House was bypassing congressional notification to rush artillery while deceptively telling Netanyahu to reduce the number of civilian casualties. Senator Brian Schatz argued that Tel Aviv is abandoning the two-state solution meant that Washington should place conditions on aid to Israel. Netanyahu is at every opportunity making things worse. Is still the United States government's position and objective to achieve the two-state solution in the mainstream of American politics and making it hard for the prospects of peace for anyone. Netanyahu saying the quiet part out loud. It's dangerous and directly contradicts U.S. policy. A must be conditioned on working towards peace. Illinois Democrat Tammy Duckworth also has sharp words for the Israeli leader. She said, "Frankly, I am appalled at Prime Minister Netanyahu rejecting a two-state solution in the Middle East because that means he's effectively ruling out a sustainable, peaceful outcome in the long term. The only viable path to a lasting peace is establishing a Palestinian nation-state alongside Israel." Senator Elizabeth Warren echoed her colleague in a post on X. She said, "The U.S. supports a two-state solution. It's the only way to ensure security, dignity, and peace for both Israel and Palestinians." Several members of the House were in line with their colleagues in the upper chamber. Representative Jayapal, a Democrat from California, said Netanyahu's position should cause us to reset our relationship of unconditional support to his government. These policies are diametrically opposed to the U.S.'s stated goals. A group of 15 Jewish House Democrats issued a statement responding to Netanyahu rejecting a Palestinian state. It said, "We strongly disagree with the Prime Minister. A two-state solution is the path forward." And so, I think this is interesting. We're seeing so much division between the Democrats and fairly prominent members of the Senate, particularly when we're talking about Jayapal, Warren, Duckworth. These are members that people recognize the names of. Them coming out against Biden, I think, is somewhat significant, is important to talk about. I'm not sure it's going to make a difference, and certainly I'm not trying to commend these, senators and legislators too much on their stand here. This genocide has been going on for 3.5 months now, and a couple of them have called for a ceasefire. Van Hollen has actually been somewhat vocal on this, so I guess he gets a little bit more credit, but the rest of them have been pretty muted, and it's not like any of them are introducing legislation to cut aid to Israel or anything like that at this point. All right, next up here, U.S. intelligence says Israel nowhere close to its goal of eliminating Hamas. U.S. intelligence officials estimate that Israel is nowhere close to eliminating Hamas after over 3 months of relentless airstrikes and ground operations in Gaza, the Wall Street Journal has reported. U.S. intelligence agencies estimate that between 20 and 30% of Hamas fighters have been killed. The U.S. estimates that the group has about 25 to 30,000 militants and a few thousand police and other types of forces. There are other militant groups inside Gaza, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The report came after a member of Israel's war cabinet suggested that the goal of eradicating Hamas is unrealistic and a veiled swipe at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He said whoever speaks of the absolute defeat of Hamas in Gaza and of no longer having the will or the capability to harm Israel is not speaking the truth. That is why we should not tell tall tales, he said. And continued, today the situation in the Gaza Strip is that the goal of the war has not yet been achieved, but the war is already not happening. There is reduced troop deployment, a different modus operandi. The journal report said that Hamas was reestablishing its police force in some areas of northern Gaza where the Israeli military has withdrawn troops despite massive destruction, demonstrating the resilience of Hamas. Israel claims that it killed 9,000 Hamas fighters, which is on the higher end of the U.S. intelligence estimates. And I think it's just pretty ridiculous. We now have the official health toll in Gaza is 25,000, including 9,600 children and 6,750 women, and 8,000 people are missing. And so by the Israeli claim, that would mean that most of the men that they have killed are members of Hamas. And if you just look at how indiscriminate the bombing campaign has been, there's no way that is true. So I'm guessing the number of Hamas killed is far lower than what Israel is claiming at this point. The U.S. also estimates that between 10,000 and 12,000 militants have been wounded, while Israel says the number of wounded is 16,000. The estimates are not confirmed since Hamas has not released casualty figures and denies that it's taking heavy losses. I think the best estimate that we've gotten from a pretty solid Hamas source was from around the time of the ceasefire, and they estimated that 10% have been wounded, and so that would have been 2,500 to 3,000. All right, next up here, Israeli officials admit they must choose between freeing hostages and eliminating Hamas. The New York Times reports, after more than 100 days of war, Israel's limited progress in dismantling Hamas has raised doubts within the military's high command about the near-term feasibility of achieving the country's principal wartime objectives, eradicating Hamas and also liberating the Israeli hostages still in Gaza. Israel has established control over a smaller part of Gaza at this point in the war than it originally envisioned in its battle plans from the start of the invasion, which were reviewed by the New York Times. That slower than expected pace has led some commanders to privately express their frustration over the civilian government strategy in Gaza and led them to conclude that the freedom of more than 100 Israeli hostages still in Gaza can only be secured through diplomatic rather than military means. The dual objective of freeing hostages and destroying Hamas are now mutually incompatible, according to interviews with 4 senior military officials. There is also a clash between how long Israel would need to fully eradicate Hamas, a time-consuming slog fought in the group's warren of underground tunnels, and the pressure applied by Israeli allies to wrap up the work quickly amid a spiraling civilian death toll. The generals further said that a drawn-out battle intended to fully dismantle Hamas would most likely cost the lives of the Israeli hostages held in Hamas since October 7th, when Hamas militants invaded Israel, killed roughly 12,000 people, and took some 240 captives, according to Israeli estimates. So just one thing I want to point out here is that when it comes to the hostages being rescued, the United States and Israel keep saying that, oh, we need the Israelis to rescue their hostages. The military is to make that happen. That's what, part of the military intervention is for. Well, if you look at the Israeli military so far, they haven't rescued a single hostage. Well over 100 have been released through hostage release agreements, so through diplomacy. And as far as Israel actually encountering any hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, they have killed them, not liberated them. 2 were, just essentially executed by an Israeli sniper, and a 3rd was gunned down while standing in a doorway. And the Israelis knew that their hostages were trying to free themselves. They had their shirts off, they were waving white flags, doing everything they can to establish that they were innocent Israeli hostages, and they were gunned down by Israeli soldiers. So if this was really about the hostages, I think the Israelis would be looking for a peace deal. But apparently that is not something happening in Israel. This from Dave DeCamp, January 18th, antiwar.com. Israeli president says no Israelis in their right mind are thinking about peace. So the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, said Thursday that no Israelis in their right mind are talking about the peace as Israeli officials continue to make clear that the onslaught in Gaza will not end anytime soon. He said at the WEF in Davos. If you ask an average Israeli about how his or her mental state, nobody in their right mind now to think about what will be the solution of the peace agreement, because everybody wants to know, can we be promised real safety in the future? His comments come as Israeli TV report that Netanyahu said Israel's current assessment is that the operations in Gaza will continue into 2025. Israeli military officials have said publicly that they expect the fighting to continue through the entire year 2024. Netanyahu has repeatedly vowed the slaughter will continue despite the growing international pressure, which includes South Africa accusing Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice. South Africa's case cites genocidal rhetoric from Israeli officials, including Herzog and Netanyahu. Herzog particularly said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. This is from October 12th. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being involved. It's absolutely not true. And we will fight until we break their backbone. So, I mean, just absolutely awful. So over the past week, there's been a communications blackout in Gaza. For at least a week, that's been a near communications, a complete total blackout. Now, I don't have the most recent update. I did see from a Palestinian journalist this morning that they were still struggling with the communications blackout. I'm not sure if some of the infrastructure has now been restored, but Israel has been bombing the communications infrastructure in Gaza to cause these blackouts. And of course, the blackouts, prevent us from seeing the images of the starving children, some of the images of the Israeli bombing campaign, and the other absolute horrors that Israel is inflicting with U.S. weapons on the people of Gaza. Fortunately, we do still have some aid workers who are braving the Israeli war in Gaza and reporting back what they see. One of these is a staff member of the World Health Organization, and that is Sean Casey. I've been talking about, his reporting for the past couple of weeks. I think he just spent 12 days in Gaza, including making a trip to the north, visiting the Al-Ali and Al-Shifa hospitals. And he has some really horrific things to say. So at the Al-Ali hospital, Casey says, I saw patients who were lying on church pews basically waiting to die in a hospital that had no fuel, no power, no water, very little in the way of medical supplies, and only a handful of staff still remained to take care of them. The Al-Shifa hospital, once Gaza's largest medical facility, is now only seeing emergency patients with a handful of doctors and nurses that remain. He said most patients have life-threatening injuries, and there were so many patients on the floor that you could barely move without stepping on somebody's hands or feet. He also witnessed the scenes at the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. Casey reports that the hospital is operating with 200% more patients than it is currently equipped for and has only 30% of the staff. He explained, patients are everywhere in the corridors, on the floor. I went to a burn unit where there was one physician caring for 100 burn patients. And if you could bring yourself to do it, and look, I'm not saying that anybody should do this or anything, because some of these images could rock you for a few days. But if you want to look at some of the burns that Palestinian children have suffered from the Israeli weapons, it's really hard, but it will help you to understand why the U.S. has to stop backing this war. In Rafah, this is bad to some of Casey's reporting. In Rafah, where Israel has ordered hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee, medical centers are overwhelmed, and doctors are seeing patients in the streets and in tents. At least 60,000 Gazans have been wounded over the past 3 months. Israel targeting medical facilities and stifling aid means innocent civilians, including children, are dying of treatable wounds. Casey reports, people are dying every day. I've seen children full of shrapnel dying on floors because there are not supplies in the emergency departments and the healthcare workers to care for them. Dr. Seema Jilani, a pediatrician and the International Rescue Committee's senior technical advisor for emergency health, said that what she saw in Gaza was harrowing and scenes out of nightmares. She said, "In my experience of working in conflict zones around the world, this is the most extreme situation I ever seen in terms of scale, severity, injuries, number of children that have suffered that have absolutely nothing to do with any of this." And so that is the nightmare of the Gaza healthcare system right now. So this is from The Guardian. I thought this was a very interesting article, especially to be published in The Guardian. U.S. officials aware of gross human rights violation by Israel, but work to preserve weapons shipments. So The Guardian reports, top U.S. officials quietly reviewed more than a dozen incidents of alleged gross human rights violation by Israeli security officials since 2020, but have gone to great lengths to preserve continued access to U.S. weapons for the units responsible for the alleged violations, contributing to former U.S. officials say the sense of impunity with which Israel has approached the war in Gaza. An investigation by The Guardian, which was based on a review of internal State Department documents and interviews with people familiar with sensitive internal deliberations, reveals how special mechanisms have been used over the last few years to shield Israel from U.S. human rights laws, even as other allies' military units who receive U.S. supports, including sources say in Ukraine, have privately been sanctioned and face consequences for committing human rights violations. State Department officials have been, in effect, able to circumvent the U.S. law that is meant to prevent U.S. complicity in human rights violations by foreign military units. This is the Leahy laws, because former officials say extraordinarily internal State Department policies have been put in place that show extreme deference to the Israeli government. No such arrangement exists for any other U.S. ally. Internal State Department documents show that the incidents were reviewed under a little-known process established by the State Department in 2020, known as the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum, in which representatives from relevant State Department bureaus examine reports of alleged human rights violations by Israeli forces. But people familiar with the process who spoke on the condition of anonymity said Israel has benefited from the extraordinary policies inside the ILVF, details of which are not previously been reported. Nobody said it, but everybody knows the rules are different from Israel. No one will ever admit it, but it's the truth. One former State Department official said to The Guardian, first, under the Israel process, all the parties involved in an ILVF review must reach a consensus that potential violation has occurred and must be approved by the Deputy Secretary of State. And so this requires, at least at times in the past couple of years, Victoria Nuland to agree that there's war crimes being committed. And I mean, that woman loves blood, so she probably just refuses to do so. Second, Israel must be consulted about alleged human rights violations that are under review and has 90 days to respond to claims, creating what some former officials say were significant delays. No other country's government must be consulted under State Department procedures, former officials said. Part of the reason why the ILVF has never worked is the process is so gummed up with delay mechanisms that exist for no other countries, the former State Department official said. In the case of at least 3 countries, Israel, Ukraine, and Egypt, the scale of foreign assistance is so great that the U.S. military assistance can be difficult to track. The U.S. often has no knowledge of where specific weapons end up or how they are used, which should be an important acknowledgement, really like a story all on its own, right? That in Egypt, Ukraine, and Israel, 3 of the most abusive and tyrannical governments on earth, all receive massive amounts of U.S. weapons, and we have no idea where they are going or how they are being used. Should be a massive concern, but Nothing to worry about here. Josh Paul, a former State Department official, said, I think that Israel feels a broad impunity when it comes to consequences within the U.S. for its actions. We may say that Israel should abide by international humanitarian law. We may say that it should not expand settlements. But when it comes to actual consequences, there aren't any. And I think that it has given senior Israeli government the sense that it is immune. Paul told The Guardian that numerous people, including himself, raised concerns over the years inside the State Department that the Leahy process is not working and that gross violations of human rights were occurring without accountability. And some of these cases even involved American citizens who were killed by Israeli forces, right? Shireen Abu Akleh, a renowned Palestinian journalist, a Palestinian American, murdered by an Israeli soldier. And the U.S. just let Israel get away with this. No consequences. It's unacceptable and unbelievable. All right, White House still opposed to a ceasefire in Gaza. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said, we do not believe a ceasefire is going to benefit anybody but Hamas. We do not support humanitarian pauses. We do support humanitarian pauses, as I said, to try to get hostages out and more aid in, but we do not support a ceasefire at this time, which I hate this man so much that you could say it's not going to benefit anybody but Hamas when there are children actively starving to death. It's just, whew. All right. Next up here, Israel destroys Gaza cemetery, claims to be seeking dead hostages. So NBC News reports Israeli troops severely damaged the cemetery in southern Gaza earlier this week in what the country's military indicated was a part of a search for hostages who were kidnapped by Hamas in an October 7th terror attack. The cemetery appeared bulldozed over on Wednesday morning, with tombstones crushed and graves holding human remains exposed in some of the burial places. I included one of the less graphic images here, just so I, don't get this show taken down or my Twitter account somehow banned or violated for posting something too graphic. But you can see that this is a cemetery that has been bulldozed. And I just read this morning that this is not a one-off thing that happened, but it's absolutely systematic. According to CNN, now 18 cemeteries have been looted by Israeli soldiers. Just unbelievably horrific war crimes going on here. Next up, UN officials say Israel rounded up and torturing people in Gaza. The head of the UN Human Rights Office for Occupied Palestinian Territory said, during my time here, I have managed to meet a number of released detainees. These are men who were detained by Israeli security forces in unknown locations for between 30 and 55 days. They describe being beaten, humiliated, subjected to ill treatment, and to what many may amount to torture. They report being blindfolded for long periods, some of them for several consecutive days. One man said he had access to a shower only once in his 55-day detention. There are reports of men who were subsequently released, but only in diapers without any additional clothing in this cold weather. And so, I mean, these are things that I cannot actually really imagine happening, that you would have thousands of men, right? And you would have a policy of not only humiliating them that while they're in detention, but when you finally release them, you just release them in a diaper. I mean, some of this is just unbelievable that this hasn't upset enough people in the White House that there isn't 4 or so human beings in the White House that are a part of this, government cabinet that get to speak to Joe Biden, that when they hear these stories that are coming from the UN, I'm not talking about what you could read, that is largely too being reported at like the Gray Zone, Mondo, Weiss, Electronic Intifada, but just read CNN, AP, and Reuters, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Some of these outlets are pretty pro-Israel, and what they describe happening in Gaza is so disgusting and horrific. Any human being with any conscience at all should be absolutely appalled, and yet there's no sense of outrage whatsoever in the White House about this. So continuing with this statement, what they told me was consistent with the reports our office has been gathering from the detention of Palestinians on a broad scale, include many civilians who, held in secretly, are often subject to ill treatment with no access to their families, lawyers, or effective judicial protection. The families of the detainees, believed to number in the thousands, have not been provided with information or the fate or the locations of their loved ones. Unless Israel can demonstrate imperatively security grounds for each person remaining in detention, they must be charged or released, which, we claim that we have to support Israel because it's this great democracy in the Middle East, except millions of people have rights less than dogs have in the United States, right? Like, you can't chain up and beat a dog in your backyard. That's illegal, but the Israelis could do that to the Palestinians. All instances of ill treatment or torture of people arrested or detained must be fully and transparently investigated, and if found to have taken place, action must be taken to ensure accountability and to prevent reoccurrence. Victims of their families have a right to truth, justice, and reparations. Unfortunately, they'll be lucky to just survive this the way the Israelis are treating them. Next up here, U.S. officials worried about escalating attacks in the Middle East will lead to war with Iran. U.S. officials speaking with the New York Times said they are concerned attacks in Iraq and Syria will kill an American soldier, and Biden will respond by ordering strikes on Iran. The Times reported President Biden and his advisors are worried that it is only a matter of time before an American soldier is killed in Iraq or Syria. The Biden administration does not want to let such attacks go without a response, but on the other hand, do not want to go as far that the conflict would escalate to a full-fledged war, particularly by striking Iran directly. They privately say that they may have no choice, however, if American troops are killed. That is a red line that has not been crossed, but if the Iranian-backed militias ever have a day of better aim or better luck, it easily could be. Administration officials say they are worried that the conflict in the region might be getting worse, not better. And so all this is, just infuriating, right? Because the White House is sitting there. American troops coming under attack once, twice a day in Iraq and Syria on average since the middle of October. And the White House is sitting there and they're saying, well, what can we do other than go to war with Iran because of this? There isn't a consideration that, maybe we tell Israel to knock off the genocide they're committing in Gaza. That way children can stop starving to death. Oh yeah, and the other benefits are we don't have to fight a war with the Houthis in Yemen and we don't have to fight a war with Iran. But that's not even a consideration. They're just hoping. They're just hoping that Israel will end their genocide in Gaza that they could prevent at any point in time. But the White House is just sitting there hoping that Israel will do it before an American soldier gets killed and then they have to fight a war with Iran. I mean, this is just beyond incomprehensible and stupid. All right, so next up here, the Prime Minister of Iraq says U.S.-led coalition withdrawal necessary for Iraq's security. And of course, if there is a war between Iran and Iraq, it'll likely, or not Iran and Iraq, between Iran and the U.S., it will likely start in Iraq. And so the Iraqi Prime Minister is saying, please get your forces out of here. We don't need to be the next battlefield. And of course, he's going to be ignored. The U.S. is just going to put more and more leverage on Iraq until they end up having to, let it happen. All right, so Dave wrote this for antiwar.com on January 21st. That's yesterday. U.S. troops injured in heavy missile and rocket attack on U.S. base in Iraq. This is, of course, significant because of the story I just talked about, that the White House is saying that if this happens, they're afraid that they're going to have to go to war with Iran. But again, rather than withdrawing U.S. troops from the region, rather than trying to rein the Israelis in, their only, real suggestion is to leave the troops out there until one of them ends up dying, and then they could go to war with Iran. So could, be worse than what we're seeing now anyways, even if it's not a U.S. troop that gets killed in Iraq and Syria that leads to the direct war between the U.S. and Iran. There are certainly other trigger points, and one of them is potentially Israel's bombing of Iranian forces in Syria. So Jason Ditz wrote this January 20th at antiwar.com. Israeli bombs Damascus residential building, killing 4, now 5 Iranian Guards member. And so this has been happening, I would say, about maybe a weekly basis over the past month and a half. And this really seems to be a direct, Israel is trying to provoke an overreaction either by Hezbollah or the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria to really escalate and ramp up this war. All right, now we're talking about the war in Yemen. U.S. prepares for open-ended war against Houthis in Yemen. Dave DeCamp, January 21st, antiwar.com. U.S. officials told the Washington Post on Saturday that the Biden administration is planning for a sustained military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, even as over a week of near daily bombing has done nothing to deter the group and has only dramatically escalated the situation. The officials could not put any timeline on how long the conflict will last, only saying they don't expect it to drag on for years, like the U.S. wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. The report said that officials acknowledged they could not identify an end date or provide an estimate for when Yemen's military capabilities will be adequately diminished. Some U.S. officials are worried for plans of an open-ended conflict with the Houthis will shatter the fragile truth between warring factions in Yemen, which includes a U.S.-backed Saudi UAE-led coalition. So far, Riyadh has urged restraint and distanced itself from the U.S. anti-Houthi operations. The U.S. also says, this article also in the Washington Post says, U.S. officials say the U.S. has little exit strategy for this conflict. And so, I mean, reading that article in the Washington Post reminded me of the 2016 or 2017 article. It was a little bit after the U.S. had decided to bat the Saudi war in Yemen, but they said, it would be long, bloody, and indeterminate, but we have to wage this war to placate the Saudis. And so this article really rings in a lot of the same ways, where this is a military conflict that they don't really have any end for. They're going to keep fighting it because, this is what they feel like they have to do to back Israel. Again, this could all be avoided if the U.S. just stops arming Israel and makes them end the genocide in Gaza. All right, next up here, U.S. and U.K. consider escalating war in Yemen. Bloomberg reports the U.S. and U.K. are exploring ways to step up their campaign against the Houthi militants in Yemen without provoking a broader war, with a focus on targeting Iranian supplies and launching more aggressive preemptive strikes, people familiar with the matter said. The risk is that more aggressive action will put the U.S. in direct conflict with Iran and provoke the sort of regional confrontation that President Joe Biden says he wants to avoid. But the considerations stem from recognition that a series of U.S. and U.K. strikes against the Houthis has so far not deterred the group or degraded its ability to target commercial shipping. In fact, the Houthis have vowed to step up their attacks in the weeks since the allies began targeting them. The people familiar with the matter, who asked not to be identified discussing the private deliberations, said the U.S. and U.K. are examining ways to better disrupt Iranian efforts to resupply the Houthis at sea, especially given that it will be harder to sever land routes. A British official echoed that arguments, saying officials are wearing various types of military operations to disrupt Iranian weapon flows to the Houthis. And one of those, I believe, so we had this story about a week ago where the U.S. said, a couple SEALs went missing off of the coast of Somalia. And I now believe that these SEALs, at least the U.S. believes that they were on an operation involved in this Yemen war, where they were trying to intercept a ship that they believed was going to provide Iranian components to the Houthis. The White House or the Pentagon produced some pictures claiming they found some. I'm not quite so sure that they found what they claim to found on that ship and that it is what they say it is. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. But that was the claim from the White House. But 2 SEALs went missing and are now considered to be dead by the U.S. about 10 days ago, the same day the bombing started. So, there should be a lot of questions here, especially from Congress, because if Biden is fighting this undeclared war and getting American soldiers killed there, it seems like something Congress should take notice of and care about. Representative Mike Turner bats Biden's bombing of Yemen. The Republican congressman from Ohio told CNN, "You can't play defense continuously, and you have to let them know that they're not going to be able to continue this. So it's very important that the president took a step in Yemen to hit the Houthis to begin to diminish their overall capabilities, but they need to know that they're not going to be paying a price for trying to diminish the ability to have commercial shipping." So, I just wanted to highlight his statements because I think he's a fairly important congressman. All right, next up here, another article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on January 21st. Lawmakers push funding to replace weapons used in Yemen. As the White House has started an open-ended and unauthorized war in Yemen, some members of Congress are pushing for legislation that would provide funding to replace the munitions dropped on the Middle East nation's poorest country in the Middle East. Politico reports, as American warships burn through expensive missiles against Houthi targets in the Red Sea, lawmakers, lobbyists, and the Navy are angling to use a multi-billion-dollar national security supplemental bill to replenish the military's inventory of munitions. In November, the Houthis announced that Yemeni forces would target Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea until Tel Aviv ends its military campaign in Gaza. 2 weeks ago, President Biden, without consulting Congress, authorized strikes on the Houthi. In response, the Houthis began targeting American-lead shipping transiting the region, while the White House is ordering attacks on Yemen nearly every day. However, the White House claims it is not at war in Yemen and does not need congressional authorization for the operations. Biden's war in Yemen could drag on for some time. U.S. officials told the Washington Post that it has no end date and little exit strategy for the military operations in Yemen. President Biden has admitted that the strikes are not deterring Houthi attacks. Additionally, the U.S. operations against Yemen are expensive. Washington has combated drone and missile attacks from Yemen on ships in the Red Sea by using its Spectre interceptor to shoot down inexpensive Houthi munitions. The White House has largely relied on ship-fired Tomahawks to hit targets in Yemen. Some lawmakers worry that operations against the Houthis will impact Washington's ability to dominate the globe. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said fighting in Yemen means Congress needs to add further spending for munitions to a supplemental military funding package. I believe that the supplemental package they're talking about, by the way, is the Ukraine bill, and so this would probably take it from like 113 billion or something that I think they want now to in the 120s to 130, 140 billion. So McConnell said, as I've warned for weeks, using $1 million missiles to defend against $1,000 drones strains an already insufficient inventory for long-range capabilities. The supplemental is our chance to expand our capacity to meet the national security challenges we face. Again, his problem isn't that we're using multi-million-dollar missiles to shoot down $1,000 drones. His problem is we're not making enough missiles to continue this absurd ratio. Senator Mark Kelly argued that additional missiles are needed to confront China. He said, "We're looking, one of the parts of the supplemental is to make sure we have the rounds we need, whether it's the long-range anti-ship missiles or potentially things like the Tomahawk that we have for the Western Pacific, and that is capability we would need if we ever got in a conflict with China." Dan Sullivan said, "A big plus up in munitions funding is imperative for Tomahawks, naval strike missiles, and harpoons." He also explained that the weapons are needed for global dominance. He said, and those kinds of weapon systems are critical everywhere, Taiwan in particular. Politico notes that the Pentagon officials and lobbyists for arms makers are also pushing for increased funding for munitions production in the supplemental defense spending bill. All right, last article here. Houthi leader welcomes war with the U.S. The New York Times reports the leader of the Yemen's Houthi militia declared on Thursday that a direct clash with the United States will only strengthen the group and vowed to continue attacking U.S. ships in the region. The Houthi leader, Malik al-Houthi, said, "We praise God for this great blessing and honor for us to be in a direct confrontation with Israel and America. We confirm the whole world that as it continues, the American-British aggression will contribute more and more to developing our military capabilities even further." And I mean, I don't want to make too much out of, the Houthis' resistance to the U.S. and things like that and glorify their resistance too much here. But if you look at the Houthis' track record, since al-Houthi took over the group's military command in 2004, they've won 6 or 7 wars against the Israeli government that were fought as civil wars, a war against the Saudi and UAE coalition, and they're now fighting the U.S. And through each war, they have only gotten stronger. Part of me believes that if aliens came and waged war on Earth, the Houthis would be firing proton missiles within just a couple months. And so, there's probably a sense here that he really is correct, that this will maybe not benefit the people of Yemen at large. It will certainly just, empower the Houthi movement, who I'm not sure how they do governing during peacetime, but during wartime, they seem to be pretty effective, not only fighters, but, holding society together and things like that. And so, maybe this actually helps them reaffirm their control in northern Yemen and everything like that by, providing another real enemy for the Yemeni people to fight against. All right, everybody, that'll wrap up the show for today. More shows later in the week. And, I'm going to be on Judge Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom, Monday at 2 p.m. If you don't, if you don't listen to it live, it's always posted up there later after. So check it out. If you like it, leave a comment section in that video, and yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in today. I'll be back with more later in the week.